Once the pressing issues of putting out the fires, evacuating the immediate area, removing debris, and isolating the reactor were taken care of, attention turned to the impact of the accident on the broader area. Radioactive dust and dirt were a major source of contamination in both agricultural and urban areas. Because of the magnitude of the accident, local and national authorities were initially uncertain how to proceed.
Our group of volunteers were basically invited by some sort of the organization which were created back there, and basically consist of very strange group of people represented by army and by some local officials which were not scientists. They were just the politicians, and they were trying to create some sort of the response. And again, first couple of weeks it was basically, not enough data or no information about plume, or no information which territory is more affected. And we were among of the first, to my knowledge, volunteer group who went there and who got, who were involved in some sort of the response.
One of the first assignments of the group of volunteers was to provide the local populace with some basic guidance about how to limit their exposure to the radioisotopes released by the plant.
That's the season when everybody in Ukraine picks up the strawberries, and Ukraine is very high in the strawberries. And actually, everybody over there, middle of the May and June, the strawberries is the best place. Tastes unbelievably good, and everybody has a strawberry growing in their backyards and garden. So the first advice which we wrote was very silly. We're saying, like, do not eat the strawberries if they are, right besides the dripping line from your roof. Then the other thing was, we were basically advising that try to have at least a bucket of water near the entrance of your door, and after you're coming from the street to your house, wash your shoes and remove your shoes. Try to not bring the additional dust.
Once the authorities began to realize the significance of the accident, they began to issue further guidance on ways to reduce exposure to contaminated dust.
And the May 5th was the first day when authorities, Soviet authorities, officially on the radio started to say, well, things are under control, but just for personal precautions, please shower regularly, try to keep dust out of the rooms, and keep your clothes laundered often, and cover the food and bread if you buy something. So it's to prevent dust from coming on the food. So there were first official guidelines for general population to minimize the exposure. My family just tried to keep everything as clean as possible, free from dust, from dirt. But the thing is that you cannot be 100% sure, of course. And later on, of course, it was not about the surfaces of your living space, but more about the food that you are getting into. And probably some accidental contamination that, for example, like the rooftops were perceived to be very dirty, and they were, in fact. So we were told, or people were telling each other, to avoid downpours from the roof. For example, if water is pouring from the roof, it's probably, if it goes and falls on your overcoat, for example, you don't want to have your overcoat to get dirty and to get rid of it later on.
As we can see from these examples, one of the primary ways people are exposed to radioactivity after a radiological event is through contaminated dust and soil that adheres to hair, skin, clothing, and shoes. One effective way to reduce this exposure is to shower frequently, launder clothing often, remove shoes and outer clothing before entering living areas, and practice general good housekeeping to reduce dust and dirt indoors. These hygiene precautions were successful in areas like Kiev after the Chernobyl accident, and they are also recommended by Centers for Disease Control and others. The decontamination activities performed after Chernobyl gives us an idea of what techniques are most effective to reduce the dose received from exposures to radiation. In the days following the accident, the area around the Chernobyl plant and the most contaminated areas in the exclusion zone were sprayed with organic solutions to create a thin film that would immobilize the dust. Buildings, vehicles, and city streets were washed frequently and sprayed with water to suppress dust. Much of the radioactivity from the accident was concentrated in surface soil, plants, on asphalt and concrete, and to a lesser extent on roofs and walls. Streets in Kiev were washed daily in the weeks following the accident. In surrounding areas, roads and buildings were washed, residential areas were cleaned, contaminated soils were removed, especially along drip lines next to buildings, and sediments were removed from the bottom of reservoirs. Decontamination activities concentrated on schools, hospitals, and other high-use buildings. Overall, tens of thousands of public buildings and residences were treated in about 1,000 cities and towns. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, street cleaning, removing trees and shrubs, and plowing soils in yards to bury the surface soils were efficient and inexpensive means of achieving significant reductions of dose. Roofs and walls also contribute to dose, but they are costly and difficult to clean and thus present a more difficult issue in the event of a radiological emergency in an urban setting.
I've heard that from people who stayed there that street washing was much more frequent during that memorable summer, that it was even much more often than usual, and they were doing a good job of keeping the city clean after all. My understanding and my feeling that in the long term, during that summer, during consequent months, government did a lot, what they could at this given time given level of technology to clean up what they could. Contaminated soil could be put out of agricultural use. Some things could be thrown away, but you cannot make clean everything. It's impossible, period. And this is what was perception that government did what they could do.
In 2008, the International Commission on Radiological Protection issued a report that provided guidance on the protection of people living in areas that had been contaminated on a long-term basis from a radiological event. The report identifies numerous actions and strategies that can be used to reduce exposures, improve living conditions, and rehabilitate the affected areas. Among the actions identified in the report that should be implemented by authorities are clean up buildings, remediation of soils and vegetation, changes in animal husbandry, monitoring of the environment and produce, provision of clean foodstuffs, managing of waste, health surveillance, and public information. The report also identifies actions that can be taken by the inhabitants of the area, including monitoring the radiological quality of their living areas and food, and the radiation exposure of themselves and their children. The following websites also provide good information on actions that can be taken to limit exposure after a radiological incident.